My next speaker in our first session is James Franklin, who is professor of politics and government at Ohio Wesleyan University, chair of the department. He is also director of the Arneson Institute for Practical Politics and Public Affairs. As a political scientist, our theme today spans not only democratic regimes and repressive regimes, but it spans sociology and political science. Jim is a political scientist. I became aware of his work first, again, with an excellent article that appeared in Mobilization, Persistent Challenges, Repression, Concessions, and Challengers to the State in Latin America, in which he asked a very important question about why activists persist and how persistence is part of the equation. His career is distinguished. He has published in Comparative Political Studies, International Studies Quarterly, Political Research Quarterly, among many other journals. He has also worked for Amnesty International and traveled in Mexico. So on that dimension, we're compadres with together. He's also a drummer. We'll have to talk about that, but we're not going to be hearing that today. Rather, we're going to be hearing about his excellent research on mobilization in repressive regimes. So James Franklin.
Okay. Let's find my slides. Okay, thanks Hank for that gracious introduction. Also, thank you for inviting me and for hosting this conference. This is just an excellent opportunity to hear from the outstanding scholars in the field and meet each other. So I'm excited to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my previous research, and also this, I've just started a new project, and this conference was an excuse for me to make some progress on this research. So I'm going to be presenting that. That's a very preliminary stage of research. I'll also be talking about the mobilization article and briefly about some other research that kind of got me to this point. Okay, so for the paper I'm delivering here, the main part of the presentation, the focus is the study of protest waves, which are phases of higher than normal incidence of protest within a country. And I'll talk a little bit about how I define those, but not go into too much detail. That's in the paper. But in studying these protest waves, I am interested in answering the question, when do protesters reach their goals in terms of concessions or even regime change? And what impact does political repression have? When is political repression able to stifle protest? When does it potentially backfire as well? Okay, so like I said, I'm going to just talk a little bit about some prior research which is relevant. It kind of got me on this track to this point where I'm in this research project right now. One of my prior research project before the current one was looking at Latin America and looking at particular contentious challenges and gathering data on the types of challenges, the tactics that were used, and looking also at government responses. A paper of mine, Contentious Challenges and Government Responses in Latin America. So it looked at over 800 contentious challenges across 7 Latin American countries and looking at how do governments respond to these challenges. And the figure here is adapted. I added these red lines. The rest of it is from the article. And this lays out the logic of the theory of what types of government responses I would expect. And so I looked at 3 different types of contentious challenges. There's symbolic protests. These do not impose direct sanctions. These are things like demonstrations. There's nonviolent disruption, which following Gene Sharp's typology of nonviolent action. This would include things like non-cooperation, what he calls nonviolent disruption, things like occupations, actually hunger strikes. He puts in this category, which actually I find should be put in a separate category. And then political violence. This earlier study looked at violent contentious actions as well as nonviolent. And the theoretical logic here is that governments weigh the costs of repression. As you can see, there's the line that the cost of repression, which is the backlash potential. There's a potential that repression could backfire and lead to even more contention and international naming and shaming and perhaps sanctions. The other line here is the cost of toleration, the level of disruption. And so for Wilson's argument about the strategy of protests is that protest is used to impose sanctions. It's to put a cost for toleration, as I see it here. So and I've also added these horizontal red lines. Challengers also set what kind of demands they make. They could be more radical, ambitious demands, or they could be more concrete, limited demands. And so that can also influence the types of options the government see and the costs they see. So, for example, for symbolic protests, the lowest cost is toleration. There's not a whole lot of disruption involved. So we'd expect in this case that toleration, which is the way I define it, it's neither repression nor concessions would be the response. And I basically find that in the study. For nonviolent disruption, they are more disruptive, but they're still nonviolent. So I theorize that there would still be significant backlash potentially from repressing nonviolent protesters, even though it is more disruptive. So in this case, for nonviolent disruption, you can see from the horizontal line here, concessions are least costly. And so you theorize that concessions would be more likely for these types of actions, and I did find that. For occupations and hunger strikes, they significantly increase the likelihood of concessions. For political violence, repression is the least costly response. These are highly disruptive, and there's probably less backlash potential for using repression against violent challenges. A lot of people in the public would probably support that in a lot of cases. So I would expect that violent challenges would be met with repression, and that's also what I found. Okay, so for this more recent study, I kind of turned things around and I was looking at the impact of repression on protests, and there's been a lot of research on this repression dissent nexus, it's sometimes called. There's almost an innumerable number of theories looking at different aspects of repression. Is it linear positive, linear negative? Is it curvilinear? Is it short-term versus long-term impacts? There's all kinds of theories. And I did things, a different approach here. I looked at each individual contentious challenge and looked at how the government responded, and then was there a subsequent challenge that included the same groups and same demands within the following 12 months. So that's a way of measuring persistence. Looking at all different ways of finding a relationship for repression, again, linear, non-linear, short-term versus long-term, I found really very little impact, consistent impact of repression on persistence. What really mattered for persistence was more about the challengers themselves. I found that challengers are more persistent when they include organized groups, when they staged a previous challenge, when they mobilize more participants. This is only for protests. That didn't apply to political violence, which tend to be small groups. And also when they seek regime change or when they oppose authoritarian regimes. And I found this to be kind of curious finding. You would think that these would be cases in which the repression would be highest when they seek regime change or when they oppose authoritarian regimes. And thinking about this, I developed what I call a filter theory. The repression filters out the less committed individuals, and it may actually stifle protests for a time, but for this study, I'm only looking at cases when there was protest, when there was contentious action. And so in this case, I theorize that when protest does emerge, these are more committed people that are involved, and so therefore the persistence is going to be greater. And I think it actually parallels somewhat statements by Larry and Dana, but Larry talking about the freedom riders and their level of commitment. Okay, so that's some earlier research. So it's got me thinking about contentious action, protest, how governments respond, the different types of tactics involved, the effect of repression. So here I'm looking at protest waves. And so I want to develop a means to identify protest waves. I have here, the starting point here is there's a data set called GDELT, which is this computer-coded events data. And I have here data for China and Mongolia. You can see some clear peaks that show protest waves, but also you see that the levels go way up near the end, which I think is an effect of more and more electronic media being available, so you have to correct for that. You also see very different levels between China and Mongolia. So I developed a method to adjust, to look for periods of higher than median protest for that particular country and for different periods of time, because protest was found to go way up in this data set later on. And so I will not bore you with all the detailed rules for coding, but the method identified 302 protest waves under authoritarian regimes during this time period of 1979 and 2011. So looking at authoritarian regimes. Nearly all cases that are identified as democratic revolutions, color revolutions, urban civic revolutions, the different authors use these terms, or really prominent failed attempts like the Tiananmen Square uprisings. Nearly all of these occurred during what are identified as protest waves using this method. However, I also found a lot of cases that aren't identified as democratic revolutions. So that you see there's very different outcomes. And also it allows me to identify some cases that aren't studied that often. Just have a little bit about kind of what some summary statistics about what I find with the protest waves. This is just a map that shows how often this method identified protest waves is occurring. So the darker the blue, the more frequent protest waves were. You can see the incidence varies a lot over year, but somewhat more common, with 2011, of course, being a huge year. The duration, most of these are short in duration, 1 year. A few last much longer. Okay, for today, I'm just starting the next phase, so I have this computer-identified set of protest waves. I don't completely trust the computer. I've gathered events data before, so I am validating these cases. I'm happy to say that I don't think computers will be replacing social scientists anytime soon, because I have found a few quirks in the data. So for this project I'm presenting today, I chose 10 countries. The plan was to choose cases that happen around the same time within the same region, but with different outcomes, so I can try to look at what might have influenced those different outcomes. So for South America, I look at Bolivia, Argentina, Chile. This Bolivian case is an interesting one because it's one hardly anyone ever studies. It's not really that prominent of a case, but it is an interesting point for comparison. Within Asia, I look at the Tiananmen Square uprising in China, also Mongolia and Taiwan, protests that occurred around the same time there. Within post-communist Europe, I have 2 cases from Serbia. My method identified one long wave. Looking at the literature, I found it was more likely 2 separate waves. So I have 2 cases from Serbia, Ukraine, and Belarus. One thing, looking at the demands, I looked more in depth myself at media reports of these protests. I found that democracy was a prominent demand, the most prominent in all of these except for Argentina, where human rights was the most prominent demand. So just initially, I'm looking at the actions of protesters, the tactics they use, things like use of non-cooperation, nonviolent disruption, the number and duration of protests. I look at the number of participants in protests. Another aspect of strength of opposition, how urbanized the country is. There's various theories that urbanization, is part of a modernization process, which should lead to the mobilization of new groups, which strengthens the opposition. So that's one factor I'm looking at. I also look at the actions and strength of authoritarian governments, particularly repression, if they use repression and how effective that is. I look at aspects of the strength of the authoritarian state. So I look at whether there are divisions within the authoritarian regime. That's a prominent factor in the democratization literature. It's also emphasis from the social movement literature looking at opportunities. I look at whether it's more of a full or a competitive authoritarian regime. And this is also interesting that one prominent scholar of democratization argues that these so-called democratic revolutions, it's really, to him, it's all just about whether the regime is strong or not. If there's a strong authoritarian regime, there's no way it can happen. They can only happen if there is a weak authoritarian regime. So that's one theory to examine here. This is a typology that shows outcomes for these cases, and I also added in one, there's another theoretical possibility here that my cases didn't fit. So we can look at whether there's democratic reform, since that seems to be the dominant demand in these protest waves. Is there democratic reform, yes or no? And also, was there a replacement of the government chief executive that occurred at the same time as the protest wave? So this then defines different types of outcomes. There's like Serbia 2000, the bulldozer revolution, the orange revolution, Ukraine are seen by many as democratic revolutions. Argentina can perhaps be added to the same category. There's many other cases where there's not actual change in chief executive, but there are democratic reforms. So I call this a democratic reform movement, including Chile, Mongolia, Taiwan, and the earlier case of Serbia. There are cases where the protest wave was repressed and stifled by the government. Of course, China is the most prominent case there, Belarus also. Bolivia is another case. Kind of interesting category here, Chile is a persistent case where they did not achieve success for several years, but they were not repressed by the government. They were persistent, so that's an area I want to look at further. There's also, theoretically, you could have cases where there is a change in the chief executive, but no democratic reforms, and Kyrgyzstan is sometimes seen as one of these stolen revolutions. So looking back at what seems to be related to outcomes, again, this is preliminary analysis. Some variables are not related to outcomes. There's just no indication that these are related to the protest rate, the number of protests, adjusted for the duration of protests per day of wave. That doesn't seem to be related to the outcomes. The percentage of events that use non-cooperation or non-violent intervention. The truth is there's not a whole lot of variety on this. There's Tarot argue that there's many tactics of protest are modular. They're easily diffused to additional locations. For example, the Belarus protest wave, it used pretty much the same script of the other two. So you don't see that much variation. There are some case aspects that I want to delve into further, looking at tactics that go well beyond this simple comparison. Also, standard aggregate human rights indicators are not related to outcomes, but I think repression is related, just not captured by these standard indicators. All right, so what is related to outcomes? For South America, the size of protests, is a factor. In Bolivia, the protests just kind of fizzled out. They're much smaller. The targeting and trend of repression. I find that repression that targets organizations is more damaging to opposition than repression that targets protesters, the reactive type of repression. Cooperation of opposition groups, either represented by a single group or a coalition of groups, that seems to strengthen the opposition, especially if they can have a variety of sectors involved in protest. Authoritarian divisions were important. Some of these cases, there were severe divisions, or the authoritarian regime was actually led by a reformer that was seen reluctant to engage in a really harsh crackdown. Also in South America and Asia, urbanization seemed to be related. The cases that had more successful protest waves were more urbanized. And just some conclusions. Government and challenger strength are important but not sufficient factors in protest wave outcomes. I mentioned that scholar who argued that it's all about the strength of the authoritarian regime. I don't think that's right. There's much more involved. And again, that case of Bolivia is a very weak authoritarian regime in a lot of ways. But they, in that case, still the protest wave was unsuccessful because the opposition was weak. There's no simple relationship between tactics and outcomes. The effectiveness of tactics need to be considered situationally, which is what I plan to do in the future research. I'm seeing there needs to be more focus on persistent protest waves like Chile. I think these are some of the most interesting cases where the authoritarian regime was strong, but the opposition was still able to overcome the resistance of the regime. Some support, again, for this filter theory of repression. We see a lot more persistence in Argentina and Chile, which had had much harsher repression in the past, and not that much persistence in Bolivia, which did not have the higher levels of repression in the past. So that could be an indicator of the level of a committed cadre of activists more in Argentina and Chile who are expecting harsh repression, and the absence of that in Bolivia. And in the future, more cases will be analyzed. And I won't go through all the detailed results of that. But thank you all.